There is a moment in American history that almost no one knows about, a quiet exchange between two men who had once trusted each other completely, and who by 1952 could barely stand to be in the same room. And in that exchange, one of them said something about George Patton that should have changed the way the world thinks about leadership, command, and the kind of power that does not wait for permission. If you've never heard what Harry Truman told Dwight Eisenhower about how Patton controlled a battlefield without orders, subscribe to this channel right now, hit the like button, and share this video with anyone who has ever wondered what separates a great leader from a merely good one. Then leave a comment below telling me which part of this story you had never heard before, because I guarantee at least one moment in this video will stop you cold. George Patton and Dwight Eisenhower first met in 1919, and almost immediately they began an argument that would last until Patton's death. Patton was 5 years older, decorated from the Great War, already carrying the swagger of a man who believed history had chosen him personally. Patton thought that the chief ingredient in modern war was inspired leadership on the battlefield. Eisenhower, by contrast, had spent the war training tank crews in Pennsylvania while Patton was fighting with them in France. Patton's dash, courage, and recklessness complemented Eisenhower's stubborn, straightforward caution. Each admired the other and benefited from the relationship. Patton strutted while Eisenhower walked. Eisenhower was usually grinning, Patton frowning. Patton indulged his moods, while Eisenhower kept a grip on his temper. What made their partnership extraordinary was precisely what made it volatile. They were not alike. They did not see war through the same eyes. They did not believe the same things about what a commander was supposed to do. But together, when the world needed them most, they created something that neither one could have built alone. And it was that partnership, and the genius it unleashed, that would eventually find its way into a conversation between a sitting president and a president-elect. At the worst possible moment in their relationship, Patton declared, "We talk a hell of a lot about tactics and stuff, and we never get to brass tacks. Namely, what is it that makes the poor soldier who constitutes the casualty list fight?" He said that to Eisenhower early in their friendship, and Eisenhower never forgot it. Leadership, Patton insisted, was the answer, not memos, not staff reports, not logistics tables that told a general what was theoretically possible. Patton believed that the officer had to get in front of the men, had to be seen, had to be felt as a physical presence on the battlefield. Patton had the ability to obtain the utmost from American troops, and some would say he obtained more than the maximum response. Through his charisma, exemplified by a flamboyant and well-publicized image, he stimulated American troops to an aggressive desire to close with and destroy the enemy. He personified the offensive spirit, the ruthless drive, the will for victory in battle. He carried ivory-handled revolvers, wore polished helmets, drove jeeps with oversized rank placards and a klaxon horn that announced his arrival from a great distance. None of this was vanity. Every bit of it was calculation, the calculation of a man who understood that soldiers do not fight for maps or objectives. They fight for the man standing in front of them. Key to Patton's effectiveness as a leader was his uncanny ability to think like an army, to use historian Eric Larabe's phrase. He instinctively knew what an army could achieve in a given situation and, just as importantly, what it could not achieve. This was not something that could be taught at staff college. It was not the product of long meetings and careful planning documents. If Patton could not understand why other superb soldiers, such as Eisenhower or Bradley, did not always allow him to do with the Third Army everything he knew it could do, it was because he could not conceive what it was like to lack the intuition that was part of his very being. But that intuition, that instinct, was precisely what made him both the most valuable and the most dangerous man in the Allied command. Because men who trust their instincts above all else do not always wait for orders. And men who do not wait for orders cause enormous problems for the men who are supposed to give them. The relationship between Patton and command authority was always a knife's edge. Patton physically struck and verbally abused two soldiers who he considered mentally weak, opposite to how he treated his soldiers who were physically wounded. Privates Charles Kuhl and Paul Bennett were suffering from battle fatigue. When Patton found them in their respective infirmaries, he ordered them back to the front lines, disregarded their debilitating stress, and physically struck them. The slapping incidents in Sicily in August 1943 nearly destroyed Patton's career entirely. As a result, Eisenhower removed Patton from operational command for nearly a year. Rather than sideline him at a harmless desk job on the mainland, Eisenhower instead opted to use him as the centerpiece for one of the most important deception operations of the entire war. In preparation for the Normandy invasion, the Allies placed Patton in nominal command of the fictional 1st United States Army Group, supposedly poised to invade France at Pas-de-Calais. The Germans believed it completely. The Germans were convinced that Patton, not Montgomery, would lead the Allied invasion into France. And so the man who had been punished was weaponized. His very reputation, his very name, used as a weapon of deception while other men fought the real battles. It was one of the cruelest ironies of the war, and Patton felt every day of it. Now subscribe to this channel if you want more stories like this one, the kind that get left out of the textbooks because they're too complicated, too morally ambiguous, too human. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who thinks they know World War II, and leave a comment below. Did you know that Patton spent nearly a year commanding a fictional army while D-Day happened without him? Write it below, because that fact alone tells you more about military politics than any classroom ever could. When Patton finally received command of the real Third Army in the summer of 1944, he moved with a velocity that stunned even the most seasoned Allied commanders. He swept across France, drove through Brittany, crossed the Moselle, and by the autumn of 1944 was pressing hard against the German border. General Eisenhower characterized Patton's Third Army as a fighting force not excelled by any other of equal size in the world. But it was in December 1944, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, that George Patton did the thing that no military textbook had ever anticipated and no other commander would have dared attempt. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched their offensive with 25 divisions, 250,000 soldiers, and 1,000 tanks, achieving total surprise. Within days, the situation on the Western Front had deteriorated into something approaching catastrophe. By December 20th and 21st, German forces had completely surrounded Bastogne, trapping the 101st Airborne Division. Eisenhower called his commanders to an emergency conference at Verdun on December 19th. The room was full of generals staring at maps that showed nothing but bad news. Patton had been methodically accumulating evidence since early November 1944 that raised suspicions in his mind that the Germans were up to something to the north, opposite the United States forces. A full week before the crisis meeting at Verdun, the day before the German attack on December 16th, Patton told his staff, "I want you, gentlemen, to start making plans for pulling the Third Army out of its eastward attack, change the direction 90 degrees, moving to Luxembourg and attacking north." So when Eisenhower turned to him at Verdun and asked how quickly the Third Army could pivot and counterattack, Patton's answer stunned the room. Patton, who had anticipated just such a move, stunned the room by replying he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The other generals stared at him. Some thought he was lying. Some thought he had finally lost his mind. The other generals stared in disbelief, thinking such a fast move impossible in winter. But Patton left the meeting, made one phone call using a prearranged code word, and the machinery he had already set in motion accelerated toward Bastogne. The truth was that Patton's Third Army had already begun moving before Eisenhower even asked. By midnight on December 18th, Patton had the 4th Armored Division heading north, with the 80th and 26th Infantry Divisions close behind. The task Patton faced was enormous. His turn north required 133,178 vehicles and tanks to grind through winter slush, mud, and ice. The move happened during one of the worst winters in 50 years, with temperatures well below freezing and roads packed with snow and retreating American units. What he had done, without orders, without authorization, without even the knowledge of his supreme commander, was begin executing a plan that required the movement of one of the largest military forces in American history, in the dead of winter, through the worst weather of the war, against a German army that had just torn a 50-mile hole in the Allied line. He did it because he knew it needed to be done. He did it because he trusted his own mind more than the process. And he did it knowing full well that if it failed, the blame would fall entirely on him. In a remarkable display of operational agility, Patton redirected 3 divisions, over 100,000 men, northward toward Bastogne. The maneuver required coordination across icy roads, congested supply lines, and hostile terrain. Patton's staff worked around the clock to reroute convoys, reposition artillery, and maintain momentum. The spearhead reached the lines of the 326th Engineers on December 26th, with a tank known as Cobra King being the first to make contact at approximately 1650. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The 101st Airborne was saved. And the last great German offensive on the Western Front had reached its high water mark and begun to collapse. Patton had done what every other commander in the room at Verdun had privately believed was impossible. He had done it because he had not waited for the moment to be perfect. He had not waited for the weather to clear or the roads to thaw or the supply lines to untangle themselves. He had begun moving before anyone told him to move, because he understood that in war, the man who waits for permission is the man who arrives too late. In April 1945, Patton was promoted to temporary four-star general but was removed by Eisenhower from his leadership of the Third Army for making inflammatory remarks concerning the denazification policies. On September 28, 1945, Eisenhower summoned Patton to his headquarters in the IG Farben building in Frankfurt. After a heated exchange, Eisenhower quietly, even gently, made what he carefully termed a suggestion. He asked Patton to accept command of the so-called 15th Army, really nothing more than a small headquarters and staff formed to compile the history of the war in Europe. It was, in every practical sense, an exile. And then, on December 9, 1945, before he could be completely pushed aside by the political machinery he had never been able to navigate, Patton was gravely injured in a freak automobile accident near Mannheim, Germany. The diagnosis was a fracture and dislocation of the third and fourth cervical vertebrae, a broken neck with spinal cord damage. Patton was placed in traction. He died 12 days later, on December 21, 1945. He was 60 years old. He had won a war and been destroyed by its peace. 7 years after Patton's death, the man who had commanded him and the man who had overseen them both found themselves in one of the most bitter presidential transitions in American history. The transition between Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower has been considered a rough one, with much tension between the president-elect and the outgoing president. Eisenhower and Truman had developed bitter feelings during the course of the 1952 election campaign. By Inauguration Day, January 20, 1953, President-elect Eisenhower had lost his normally sunny disposition when the subject of President Truman came up. The two men had worked together to win the greatest war in human history, and now they could barely speak to each other across a table. It is uncertain whether Truman demanded that General George Patton be removed because of his post-war remarks about the Soviet Union following the Nazi capitulation. Nevertheless, Eisenhower, who had been Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, removed Patton. That decision, whether it came from Truman, from political pressure, from the weight of Allied diplomacy, had remained a shadow between the two men. And in the charged silence of their one formal transition meeting, it was Eisenhower who finally asked the question that had been gathering for years. He asked Truman how a man like Patton had been able to control an entire army on the battlefield without waiting for orders, how he had pivoted his forces before anyone told him to, how he had moved first and asked permission later, and how that instinct had saved the war in the West. And Truman, who had spent years carrying the weight of that question, looked at Eisenhower and said, "That was not a flaw. That was the whole point." The answer Truman gave, that Patton's willingness to act before being authorized was not insubordination but the very essence of genuine command, is the kind of insight that changes how a person thinks about leadership forever. Because what Patton understood, and what both Truman and Eisenhower struggled with for different reasons, is that real authority does not come from a title or a chain of command. As 3rd Army Lieutenant John Ingalls put it, Patton had an unequaled sense of what was possible on the battlefield. "We knew what General Patton expected us to do, and we believed that if we did it, we would win." That belief, that absolute, unshakable belief that flowed from Patton to his men, was not something that could be manufactured in a staff meeting or written into an operations order. It was the product of a man who had spent 30 years studying war, who had read every military history ever written, who had stood on ancient battlefields and tried to feel what the commanders who fought there had felt. Throughout his career, he had learned the intricacies of his profession. He read enormously, voraciously, in the literature of warfare and history. Not only was he conversant with the field and technical manuals of his time, he was also familiar with the pages of history. Patton was not an instinct. He was a lifetime of preparation walking around in the body of a general. What the story of George Patton, Dwight Eisenhower, and Harry Truman ultimately teaches us is that the most dangerous thing in any organization is not the man who acts without orders. It is the organization that has no one capable of acting without them. Truman understood this because he had been the man who gave the hardest orders in human history, and he knew better than anyone that orders can only take you so far. At some point, in the frozen dark of a Belgian forest with 100,000 men and the fate of Europe depending on the next decision, someone has to act. And the one who acts in that moment, the one who has prepared so completely, thought so deeply, and believes so absolutely that he moves before the room has even agreed he should, that person does not need orders. They have already given them to themselves. For Patton, Leadership was never simply about making plans and giving orders. It was about transforming oneself into a symbol. A symbol that soldiers would follow into the worst winter of the century, across frozen roads, through enemy fire, toward a town they had never seen, because they trusted the man who had pointed north and said, "Go." That is what Truman told Eisenhower. That is what both men knew, and what they could never quite say out loud until the war was over and the politicians had done their worst. And that, after everything, is the lesson that outlasted all of them, that if this story changed the way you think about leadership, command, or the men who shaped the 20th century, then do something that costs you nothing but means everything to this channel. Subscribe right now, like this video, and share it with someone who leads people, who studies history, or who simply wants to understand what separates the commanders who change history from the ones who are forgotten by it. Leave a comment below telling me what you didn't know before watching this video. Whether it was Patton moving his army before Eisenhower asked, the year he spent commanding a fictional force, or the bitter silence between two presidents who had once won a world war together. Your comment is what keeps this kind of storytelling alive. And every story this channel tells exists because someone, somewhere, decided it was worth sharing.